Hey fearsome friends, and welcome back. Have you ever wondered why that creepy teacher from high school acted the way they did? Or why that strange man was hanging around your workplace pretending to be an employee? I have. And even though I did wonder about these people, ultimately I didn't want to know. Here are 15 encounters with similar questions. So sit back, relax, and get cozy, comfy, warm. Because it's time to let your nightmares in. Back in the 2000s, I was going to a Catholic school, and for sports we had this gym teacher named Coach Ricky. Now thinking back on everything that happened, there were some giant red flags with this guy. But as a kid, you don't notice these things, I guess. Now the first red flag would be how he'd keep the boys and girls separated, which was weird because none of the other gym teachers ever did that. The second red flag was that he would pay more attention to the girls and would practically ignore the boys. Also, if he saw one of the girls talking to one of the boys, he'd get really angry, which would be the only time he'd ever acknowledged the boys even existed. He'd have the girls doing their exercises. Meanwhile, the boys could just sit around doing literally nothing. But if one of the girls were to sit down, even for a second, he would get really angry. Now at this time I was diagnosed with a heart murmur, and the doctor told me that I couldn't exercise because of it. But when I told my gym teacher this, he became irrationally irritated about it. Fast forward to coming back from Thanksgiving break, and Coach Ricky was gone, with the teachers pretending that the guy had never even existed. And when you would ask about him, they would act like they didn't know who you were talking about. So I asked my favourite teacher about it a few times, and she eventually told me what had happened. He had apparently gotten caught watching the girls undress in the changing room, and there was even a rumour that he had tons of videos of it on his phone. My teacher didn't even know the whole story, because the school had kept a lot of it under wraps, so no one even knew whether or not the police were called, and nothing was ever reported in the newspaper. I live in a small town, so that would have definitely been a scandal. And to this day I still wonder if he'd ever gotten anything of me. It makes my skin crawl just thinking about it, and I hope that creep is in jail for what he did. With my now husband, in the first 5 years we were together, we had a long-distance relationship and lived thousands of kilometers apart. One time when I was visiting him, it was a Saturday afternoon and we had decided to go out. He lived in a huge city, and specifically a few streets away from the center. It was a tiny street, relatively quiet, and at one end of it there was a police station. So as I'd said, we headed out this afternoon, and at the opposite end and corner of the street where the police station was, I noticed two guys sitting next to each other on a piece of broken concrete. I was dressed up pretty girly, or womanly, to feel pretty for my boyfriend, wearing some makeup, and had generally made an effort, nothing extra, as I was just always the type of woman who liked pretty and elegant, but never too much. Too short, too tight, or too come and get it, if you know what I mean. Stepping out of our building, I immediately spotted them and got horrible vibes. We were about 4 to 5 meters away before we'd passed them, and when we did, I was at their side. I remember how much I was squeezing my boyfriend's hand, and I didn't take the corner of my eye off these guys. My heart was pounding, and my entire body was in full alert mode, ready for almost anything bad to happen. I'd noticed them looking at me as we passed, but thank goodness nothing happened, and I began to calm down a little. When we'd gotten far enough away, I asked my boyfriend if he'd noticed them too, and gotten the same bad vibe that I had, but he hadn't paid attention at all. Coming back on the same road about 3 or 4 hours later, it was fully dark by now, and these guys were still there, sitting in the same spot. After we'd passed them and turned onto our street, my boyfriend suddenly stopped and said, "Oh, we're out of water." So he was going to pop into the small shop right next to the upper corner of our street to buy some, as tap water in the city wasn't drinkable. I entered our apartment and he quickly turned around and left. I continued to our apartment building, finding that the stupid main entrance door was closed at this time, then realized I didn't have the key. I stopped in front of our building and turned into the direction of the corner where my boyfriend had gone, and of course those two bad-faced guys were still there. My heart stopped beating for a moment, as one of them stayed sitting where they had been seemingly all afternoon and evening, as if he was keeping guard, but the other one had started to walk towards me very slowly, with his hand in his pocket. In that moment I could see my life flash before my eyes like it was a movie. I was fully frozen with fear and I couldn't move. I forgot everything in the moment, even forgetting to open my mouth to scream, or run towards the police station that was maybe only 10 meters behind me. I stood there and watched as the danger was closing in on me, and when the guy was maybe 2 meters in front of me, I heard a quiet whistle from his buddy. So he stopped and turned back immediately, walking slowly as if nothing was going on. I was thinking, what the hell, and thank God. And for a tenth of a second I couldn't understand what had made him change his mind and turn around. And that's when my boyfriend showed up in front of my eyes at the corner. His buddy had clearly seen him coming from where he was sitting. Then he whistled to warn his partner, and my potential attacker stopped and turned back. It was insane. Even when my boyfriend showed up, they kept their eyes on me and saw us going into the building. I was totally shaken up and my body was quivering. I couldn't and still can't describe the fear and horror of how they made me feel. I honestly don't know what their plan was exactly, but I suspect that they were at least going to rob me, because as I said, it was the middle of the city. However, I hadn't got anything valuable on me, not even a piece of jewelry. Once we'd gotten upstairs into the flat, I told my boyfriend what had just happened and freaked out. He still hadn't noticed anything was going on, and he didn't understand why I hadn't screamed or run to the police. I don't understand either, quite honestly. I just became totally frozen. This was 8 to 9 years ago now since it happened, but I still feel that heavy fear whenever I think back about it. Please, people, if you get any negative vibes from a person, just run. Now, the streets of the Lower East Side of New York City in the early 80s were usually a dream for your typical heroin addict, of which there were roughly 1 million at this time, citywide. A simple walk from, say, Avenue B and 2nd to 3rd Street would usually permit you to pass at least 4 or 5 drug dealers, or spots where you could buy heroin or cocaine. But this night was different. My friend Mario and I were going out to cop some dope at around 9:30 p.m. The police presence was heavy and things were generally shut down. As you walked those streets, you encountered other junkies from all classes and backgrounds, all caught up in the heat of finding the needed fix. We decided to check out the Original. This was a spot in a lot which was once a building, but had been demolished, and there was only rubble surrounded by huge piles of debris. The way this spot worked was in the dead of night, you'd stumbled into this hellhole and waited for someone to tell you to line up. That meant service was coming. Just as long as some nasty junkie didn't try to rob or beat you as you waited in the darkness. But this night, you could feel it in the air, how palpably the tension grabbed you by the belly. There must have been 25 people all there to cop. The tout who announced the arrival of the dealer and directing the people kept disappearing, looking nervously over his shoulder. Then he'd disappear and we all didn't know what would come next. Several times we heard the scream, "Va hondo!" That meant police and it meant scram. We kept running out of the lot and congregating back there after 10 minutes, but the crowd grew to about 40, I'd guess. Now, unlike other establishments, which often were holes in the walls of abandoned buildings, Original just had a wall that everyone lined up against, like a firing squad. The dealer or dealers would run down and start serving both ends of the line, if you were lucky. Sometimes only one would come down and offer express service for a fee. If you pay up $5, you get served sooner. But that night was moonless, and this was becoming a daunting project. Finally, all of us mulling about heard, "Line up!" People jostled one another to form a line, and there we all were. But nothing. No one was coming. The most hopeful waited anyway, and that night it was everyone. Suddenly I heard a loud boom. I turned in the direction of the sound and saw a man waving a pistol with a chrome plate reflecting the single high-crime lamp that was maybe 20 yards away. Boom. He shot again. He ran down the pile of debris, followed by his assistant. "Everyone, face the wall." He and his helper then started to rob everyone stuck there. He was actually a bad cop from the 8th Precinct, as I found out later. And like a cop, each person in line was asked for their wallet, and sometimes he asked for ID. Then he'd grab the wallet and pull out the cash. Now Mario had my money. He was going to be the drug buyer that night. So when they got to me, I said, "I don't have any money. My partner down the line has it." He raised the pistol like he was going to hit me with it, but didn't. He was just showing frustration, I guess. Then once again, suddenly, boom. He fired and yelled for everyone to get out fast. To my right, a large pile of debris and garbage about 10 feet high was my closest exit point. I scrambled onto it, hoping to surmount it and get the hell out, yet I couldn't quite do that. I was caught hanging by my feet. I knew that Mario had gotten away before the pigs corralled everyone, so there was still hope. But damn, I couldn't get over it. Boom. One more pistol discharge from behind me and zip. I was up and over the obstacle in a hot second. I checked myself for bullet holes and went down the street looking for Mario. We were not to be deterred. There was a spot on East 3rd Street called Executive. Executive's building had been mostly gutted by fire, and the entrance had a tout and we went in. There was no electricity anymore, but there were candles lit on the dilapidated stairs leading up to our hopes. We went up one flight, then another, where everything smelled of char. Finally, another set of stairs. It was so dark except for the 1 or 2 candles every 15 feet or so. Now here was the dealer. How many? But before he could finish, we again heard the cry of alarm from below. He scuttled into the darkness. There were maybe 15 buyers up there with me and Mario, and what they did intimidated me to this day. In near pitch-black darkness, people moved through the hole of a fallen wall onto wooden or concrete beams that connected the buildings. These beams were about 1 foot wide, maybe 14 inches, all in darkness. Mario too took this route, and I saw people rushing with their arms extended across the girders. But it wasn't for me. I started to search for a hiding place, and as I did so I could hear the cops laughing as they discovered people, and I also heard screams of pain and an occasional loud thwack. I saw in the shambles of a room a bathtub filled with plaster, so I decided I was going to have a plaster bath. I tried to cover myself in the tub so no one would see me, but I was not so successful. As the cops hit the 4th floor, I heard very distinctly a jovial voice saying, "Well, hello there." I was petrified. They told me to get up, so I did. They seemed to be in a good mood. The 2 of them asked me some questions and wanted to look at some ID. I was shaking, expecting blows, but they merely told me to go down from whence I came, and I happily obliged. The fact that I was white may have helped me in this situation, since they were cheerfully clubbing other, presumably dark-skinned, people as my ears perceived it. I went home. Mario had my money, and I prepared for a night of withdrawal symptoms. Luckily, Mario was a friend, and he showed up with a few bags of dope later. So I, a 25-year-old female, am told that I look 16 or 17, and it has been a bit troublesome at times, because there's a ton of creeps out there who like teens. Whether this factors into the reason this happened, I don't know, as it's not uncommon for this to happen. But either way, I keep 2 knives and mace on me when I go out. Another thing to keep in mind is that someone I knew had assaulted me just weeks prior to this incident, so I was already afraid that either they or their friends would follow me again. Now I work late and was walking home. It was by a busy street, and a man who was standing behind an apartment gate said, "Ma'am," and then once again. I continued to walk on. It was rather windy, and the wind blew past my ears, which made it harder to listen for footsteps. So instead I was using the reflection of passing cars, and also shadows for my blind spots. I turned a corner into my neighborhood, looking behind me as I did so, and thankfully no one was there. Good. I continued walking, yet this feeling of being watched was getting stronger and was beyond eerie. Then another street came for me to cross, and I looked behind me again. A faint silhouette, or was it a shadow? As I looked at it, it seemed to be moving. So I thought to myself, there is a good chance that that is a person, but stay calm. I crossed the street and continued walking, keeping the possibility I was being followed in my radar. There was a huge house up ahead with tall hedges, which I was going to use to take a longer look. And there was also another house with 2 large Dobermans that always woke up their owners when I walked by it. At times I would use the Doberman house to see how many houses away I was from whoever followed me. It has happened before. I came up to the hedges and looked behind me, but nothing. It was extremely dark and windy, just the worst for seeing if you're being followed. So I kept walking and changed direction just in case. I then stood behind a large tree to see if someone would walk by in the old direction I was walking, or turn the corner into my new direction. But to my dismay, the house had a motion detection light, and my shadow was cast all the way across the street. Of course. Just totally what I wanted to happen. Perfect. Why not just display to the person following me that I'm chilling behind this huge tree? Thankfully no one walked past, so I went to the other side of the street and looked back again. Then I saw a silhouette of a man walking. I turned to leave and he said, "Ma'am." I kept going and he said, "Ma'am, can you tell me where the high street is?" I replied, "Sorry, no, I don't know where it is." His hands were concealed in his pockets and never moved out of them. Not knowing if he had a weapon, being just bigger and stronger than me was reason enough for me to stay back and be aware of any possible intentions. We had been at a distance of 1.5 houses away from each other at this point, and he was standing in the middle of the street. Just this completely black silhouette standing in the shadows between the dim street lights. He walked closer and I took a few steps back. The area he had walked into, the light from a street lamp, hit his lower torso, and he was wearing a grey sweater with a design on it. Then I remembered a few roads back, the man that was behind the fence had a grey sweater on in the same design. He stopped and said, "I'm not a creep, I just need directions." I said once again, "Sorry, I don't know where it is," which honestly I didn't. He took 4 to 5 steps forward and I walked backwards, meeting his pace, and he said, "I couldn't hear you." He then stopped walking forward and I replied, "No." Then he asked, "Do you have a lighter?" Now that's 3 attempts he had made to convince me to come closer. I just said no again and turned around. It was definitely time to go. We had been much further away from the apartments at this time, and there was no way a grown man had any good intentions following me down a dim neighborhood. To ask for directions and then a lighter when it was apparent that I wasn't planning on closing any space between us. I had the distance, and I could tell our loudish conversation from him trying to talk must have gotten someone's attention in the homes. And if not, the Doberman house had been only 1 house away. I had distance, awareness. I wasn't falling for it. I walked home in a huge pattern and just went inside. I'd already had enough to think about and deal with, but I'm definitely not going that way again. I just don't seem to be able to catch a break. This happened way back in October of 2006. At that time, I was just a 19-year-old kid, always on the lookout for adventure. One Friday night, after wrapping up my shift at McDonald's, I met up with some friends who suggested we check out this haunted location called White's Bridge. My one buddy Brandon said he had recently learned about it and began telling us the legends associated with the 100-year-old wood-covered bridge. Never one to turn down a spooky experience, we all piled into my green Ford Taurus and headed out on our journey. Brandon gave directions, guiding me off the main road, and within minutes we were on the dirt back roads, surrounded by woods and cornfields. Our only point of reference was a blinking cell tower off in the distance. We could tell we were getting further from the city as our cell phones began slowly losing service, and as we rode deeper and deeper into what legitimately felt like the absolute middle of nowhere, Brandon repeated the legend associated with the bridge. So back in the early 1900s, a local farmer discovered that his beloved wife had been cheating on him, and in a fit of rage he killed her and her lover after discovering them in the act. After committing the cold-blooded murder, the farmer left his home and wandered the dirt roads in a daze. He eventually came upon White's Bridge, where the realization of what he had done finally began to sink in, and deciding he would rather die than face the consequences of his actions, he hoisted a rope up and over one of the bridge's rafters and hung himself. As far as I can tell now, the story is complete fiction, but we totally believed it at the time. So after a long and bumpy ride, Brandon instructed me to turn right on an off-road that I wouldn't have noticed was even there had he not pointed it out. So I took the turn, and there before us was White's Bridge. It looked like something straight out of a horror film. An old wood-covered bridge, aged by time, sitting alone above a river deep in the middle of nowhere. We parked the car on the side of the road and got out to explore. Immediately catching our eyes was a scarecrow lying abandoned at the entrance to the bridge. My friend Mike, who was known as somewhat of a risk-taker, and a stupid one at that, picked up the scarecrow and lit it on fire. The hay body burst up into a ball of flames, and Mike waved it around proudly next to the old dry wood bridge. Realizing the risk, I told him to throw the damn thing in the river and put it out, which thankfully he did. After making sure there weren't any rogue embers that could ignite the bridge, Brandon suggested we get back in the car and pull it onto the bridge. He explained that the legend was that if you parked your car in the middle of it, put it in neutral and killed the engine, the spirit of the dead farmer would push the vehicle forward to get it off the bridge. Naturally, we had to try this. We piled in and did exactly as he said. We parked halfway across the rickety old bridge and killed the engine. We sat in the pitch black saying nothing, waiting for something, anything to happen. The only sounds were the creaking of the bridge, the river flowing beneath us, and footsteps. Suddenly the back driver's side door opened, and a woman abruptly entered the back seat, cramming in next to my two friends back there. She looked to be in her late 20s, early 30s, long straight black hair, slim, and wearing a red plaid shirt and blue jeans. "I saw your fire signal for me," she said. Wait, what?" I replied, totally freaked out and at a complete loss for words. "I'm so glad you came. My boyfriend's car broke down that way. I need a ride back." My brain was doing its best to compute the situation. "I'm sorry, who are you?" I asked. "What are you doing out here?" "I told you," she responded curtly. "My boyfriend's car broke down over there. Can you please just give me a ride so I don't have to walk all the way back?" She was pointing ahead towards a narrow road that forked off to the right on the other side of the bridge. My friend Mike, the scarecrow burner, and ever the gentleman added, "I mean, if you need a place to stay, you're more than welcome to come crash at my place. I got plenty to drink," and I interrupted him. "No, lady, listen, I'm sorry, I don't know who you are. You just got in my car, and this is all really weird. You could be an axe murderer." She let out an angry sigh and got out, walking back in the direction from which she came and disappearing into the night. I started the engine right up and looked at my friends. They all had looks of disbelief on their face, and without saying a word, I put the car in drive and slowly rolled forward and off the bridge. We needed to turn around and go back across it to get back to where we had come from, and the only way to do that was to pull onto the side road that the woman said her boyfriend's car had broken down on, and then reverse. As I pulled onto the side road, my headlights illuminated the 3 posted signs that I hadn't been able to see from the bridge: "No trespassing," "Private property," and "Do not enter." Looking up the road, there was no sign of the woman. It was as if she had literally vanished. I didn't want to stick around though, so I backed up and crossed the bridge again, and from there began the journey home. We didn't have much to say on the ride home, as I think we were all equally stunned, except for Mike, who asked if he knew anyone that would be awake at this hour that he could score some weed from. I visited White's Bridge a couple of times after that, but nothing of note happened in my subsequent visits. Sadly, some delinquents burned down the old White's Bridge some years ago. It was rebuilt, but from what I hear it's just not the same as the original. I don't have any plans to go and check it out though. So this happened in early January 2021. I was on my way back home with a friend, and we were driving on the highway around 10 to 11 p.m. on a Saturday night. We'd initially planned on staying at the friend's house we had just left after a night of hanging out and good fun, but his recently broke-up ex-girlfriend came to hang out, so when things winded down, we decided it was best to give them some private time. Now the host lives in the suburbs where it's very wooded with few streetlights, which is kinda creepy in itself. But we made it to the highway and were cruising along. About midway to our city, 15 to 20 minutes out from where we were on the highway, we were just listening to Spotify and having a good conversation as we drove along. There were very few cars on the road, say 1 or 2 every mile or so, if not longer, and it was dark out, and no one was really around. We were in the centre lane of 3 lanes, going about 65 miles per hour. The speed limit is 55. And there was a car about a half a mile ahead in the right lane, driving slower, but not by much, probably about 60. We were slowly but surely catching up to them, and eventually passed them. I had cruise control on, and after we'd gotten, say, 40 to 50 feet past them, the car sped up and seemed to be matching us. The car was now steady alongside us on the right, and I thought, no big deal. Some people get triggered when they get passed, and because the way I passed was gradual, because of the cruise control, maybe that did it. I ignored them and carried on talking to my friend. But here's where it gets weird. In the left-hand lane, there was an SUV moving pretty fast, coming up from the rear about a quarter of a mile behind. I was steadily getting closer, higher speed, but it was in the left lane and it was late at night, so I figured they just wanted to get to where they needed to fast. But right when I expected them to pass by, it continued forward at speed, then drastically slowed down to match our speed too. They'd done all that speeding behind me just to catch up to me and the other car. So now we were 3 cars in 3 lanes, all going the same speed, which theoretically is no big deal. But there's no cars in front of us at all, and we were the only cars around on our side of the road. I looked at the car to the right, and it was a black 10-year-old Camry with tinted windows. I looked at the car to the left, and it was also black, and about 10 years old as well. It was an Escalade with tinted windows. What are the chances of 2 blacked-out cars suddenly matching my speed at night on both sides with no one in front of us, i.e. no reason to speed match? Especially since we were previously all going independent speeds, and now they'd either sped up or reduced speed to match me. It just seemed incredibly odd. I asked my friend if they could see what was going on, and if they thought it was odd as well. Was I being paranoid? They did see that the Escalade to the left had slowed down to match us, and that it was odd. But they also thought I was thinking too much of it, and said it was probably just a coincidence. Regardless though, I still felt creeped out. Then a few seconds later, about a single minute after the blacked out Escalade to the left was matching us, another car appeared behind us in the middle lane, also dark in colour. But it was night time, so I couldn't really see into their car from behind, or make out what it was with the headlights in my view. Now because I was too focused on the cars directly to my left and right, I didn't notice how long it had taken them to appear and catch up. But they were about 20 to 30 feet behind us, when I did notice they were gaining, and they'd reached a normal distance behind us and maintained our speed. So at this point we were 4 cars, all at the same speed and all together. By this time all my red flags were flying high, so rather than see where this was going to go, I took the car out of cruise control and floored it. I was immediately going 90 miles an hour, then 100, and with absolutely no subtlety, I created pure distance between me and them. I looked back and now the middle car was matching speed with the other 2 cars, which were to my left and right, which in my paranoid mind confirms collusion, so I continued to speed away. I was now steadily speeding down the freeway at about 85-95, and I slowed down a bit, but not by much. I openly risked getting a ticket just to gain some ground on these people. Eventually, they just became a pair of headlights in the distance, still 3 in a row across, and I was now reaching the outskirts of the city, where there was a decline in the pitch of the road. Thankfully, we didn't end up running into those folks again, and my friend was still rather unconvinced as to whether we actually were in a potential situation or not. They were unconvinced that I needed to react the way I did, and figured it could have gone either way. But I couldn't explain 3 blacked-out cars matching our speed when they previously hadn't been, and blocking us in on all sides when no one else was around on the roads late at night. It just didn't seem right and felt like an ambush waiting to happen. They didn't give chase, thankfully, but it was way too odd for comfort. Maybe I was incredibly paranoid and did freak out too much, but I just didn't want to mess around and find out. This happened when I was growing up around 2004 to 2005, and I was about 13 years old. It took place in a rural area, a good ways outside the town of Uvalde, Texas. The town itself was really small back then, and not much to look at, and it's just one of those towns that really isn't on the way to anywhere important. My father knew someone who owned a deer lease that was about 1,000 acres down outside of that area and was complaining about a ton of hogs that were tearing up their land. Being open season on hogs in the south, my dad thought he would surprise me that summer and take me down for a week to go hunting for them. Not only did that help him with networking for his job, but it also gave us some quality father-son time. I remember the drive down there from Dallas was torture. It was about 7 hours in my dad's hardtop Jeep Wrangler, and that car was so uncomfortable, I hated it. All there was to do was either stare out the window or try and beat Super Mario Land 2 on my Game Boy Pocket, something I was never able to accomplish in my youth. The drive, obviously, took most of day one, so we got there in the early evening. The owner of the land had told my dad that he hadn't had anyone lease it that year yet, and the cabin in the property might be a little rough and dusty. I didn't really care. At this point in my life, I had been in Scouts for a couple of years and spent a lot of my free time in the woods or fishing with friends. So needless to say, I was pretty comfortable roughing it. So after unlocking the gate and driving to the cabin on the land, we settled in. The cabin was rough, dust and dirt everywhere, flies, and I remember that it looked like some raccoons had gotten in there and crapped on the floor. After cleaning up a bit and getting the sleeping bags out, then setting up the cots, we decided to sleep. But something about that night was weird. I never was able to get comfortable enough to fall asleep for any restful amount, but I couldn't put my finger on why I had that feeling of being watched. I was finally able to drift off for what I guessed was an hour maybe. Then we woke up early, about 7 a.m. We decided to scout around the land for tracks and signs of hogs and find a good place to set up a blind. It was the summer and horribly hot in the afternoons, so morning was the best time to be out and about. After walking for an hour or so, we came to an area of trees, lightly dense, and luckily found some signs of hogs, typical torn-up ground where they had been rooting, so we followed them into the trees. I was looking for more signs when my dad stopped me with his arm. I remember looking up and seeing someone standing about 50 yards away, and part of their body was blocked by trees. Now this was private land, so they definitely weren't supposed to be there. We also had confirmation from the owner before we got to the lease that nobody was there, not to mention the gate was locked up when we first arrived. The person was wearing some bright-coloured red jacket, and we slowly walked towards them. My dad called out something like, Hey, we're hunters. This is private land." The person didn't move at all, was just dead still. We were about 30 yards away and could see that he was turned away from us with his hand in his pockets. The weird thing was that the person was in a ski jacket and what looked to be ski pants. Now this is Texas in the summer. It was about 98 degrees out by then. My dad called out again, but no reaction. He told me to stay behind him and unsnapped the clip to his pistol holster. That's all we had at the time, since we were only scouting the area. The rifles were back at the cabin. We approached the person's right side, and then my dad told me to stay put about 20 yards away. I stayed crouched down, watched him circle around the man, all the while talking to him, asking if he was okay. He finally passed around the man, and my dad stood straight up with a confused look on his face. I called out and said, "What's wrong?" And he called back saying, "It's a mannequin." I walked over to it while my dad stood there staring, and as I got closer, one thing stood out the most. The clothes it was wearing were brand new. No dust, sap, bird droppings, or signs of being outside for more than a day at most. At that moment, I looked at my dad and could see him getting worried. Almost immediately after, I felt that feeling again, like we were being watched, and I knew my dad felt it too. I wanted to start crying, I remember feeling suddenly so scared, when my dad whispered, "We're leaving right now." He grabbed my hand and drew his pistol. He scanned the area the whole way back while I was trying to hold back panicked tears. We got back as fast as we could, and I was terrified, so it felt like an eternity, but in reality was only about 45 minutes. After returning, we packed up and beat feet. We drove back home that day and didn't talk much on the way back. I remember right after we left, my dad called his buddy, the owner of the land, and he was confused. He said that he would go check it out next week when he was in the area, and he also said that he had never had an issue with people because his property was high fenced. My dad normally isn't a paranoid person, but me being young and the least possibly having someone there we didn't know about, he decided to be cautious and just got out of there. After we got back home, we talked, and my dad wasn't able to sleep the night before as well. He had the same feeling but didn't want to wake me up because he thought I was sleeping too. Turned out that next week he got a call from his buddy, and he checked the whole property and never found any trace of anyone, no mannequin or anything. That story still makes my hair stand on end. No idea what that was, but the paranoid man in me thinks it was some kind of trap or something. Not the creepiest thing that happened to me in the woods, but definitely in the top 3. It was an icy evening in early 2017, shortly after my 15th birthday. I was hanging out with one of my friends after school, and we decided to just take a walk around the general area. We were out longer than expected, but eventually we parted ways. It was about 6 in the evening. We usually left school at around 2:45 p.m, and it was the middle of winter in Finland and very dark outside, and I didn't want my parents to be concerned. The sun had set particularly early on that day, and the surrounding air had turned a very bitter, biting cold, and the leftover snow from that day created a bright, beautiful glow. This was some time after I'd learned to actually walk to school on my own, and I was used to going home fairly late, so I was never really scared of going that distance by myself in the evening. My school was about half an hour away from my home. So I hopped onto a bus, and it was about 6:15, 6:30 when I finally got off at my stop. A few minutes after, I ended up on the intersection between the road I was on and the quiet road that my house is on. But as soon as I'd walked across to the end of my road and made the first turn, I stopped in my tracks as I saw a woman standing in my path, staring me straight in the eyes. She was about my height, around 5'8", maybe even a bit taller, had long, thick, jet black hair, was whip-thin and ghostly pale in both her skin and clothes, clad in a rather simple dress. Her eyes were empty and grey, and she didn't say a word. I shifted around for a second, looking back, debating whether or not I should just pass, or if it would be rude if I turned around to see if someone else was close by and could pass by her safely. But nobody else seemed to be around. She also stood next to a house with an open and dilapidated entrance, so I also perhaps wondered for a moment if she had resided there and if I was rudely intruding in her space. All became quiet around us, and I was wondering in that moment what to do. I sort of lifted my hand a little bit, not really intending anything by it, and to my surprise she responded by lifting her own long but thin hands and smiling a little bit. She started walking towards me, and I turned around, briskly walking back to the intersection. For a second I thought I had just imagined the whole thing, but then I saw the woman again, still just staring. But this time having turned towards the opposite sidewalk away from me, just staring into the sky. I determined at this point that it was safe to walk past, but I noticed that she had sort of craned her neck to my side ever slightly as I walked past. I started to quicken my pace as I approached the next turn, and looked back to see her staring once again. This happened during the early 2000s when I was living in a crack house in Vermont. There were a lot of people coming and going on a regular basis, doing drugs, selling drugs, and buying drugs. One of the people that visited us was part of a biker gang called the Green Mountain Boys, and we used to chill out with him and smoke weed. He was really chatty and bragged about things I neither wanted to hear nor needed to hear, and quite frankly, he wasn't allowed to talk about probably, but that didn't stop him. On one occasion, we visited a trailer park where one of the veteran members of the bike gang was. We sat down in his kitchen to smoke some weed, and my crackhead landlady told him about his younger gang member being a chatty Cathy. He listened quietly and looked at me and said, "Can you corroborate what she is telling me?" "Yeah, man, absolutely. Dude shows up at least once a week and tells us about what y'all are up to." The old man looked at me with squinted eyes and shook his finger. "I'm going to look into this. If you're right, that boy is going missing. You understand me? So be sure you're telling the truth. If I end up taking care of this kid and we find out later you're lying to me, I will bury you next to him." I had a sinking feeling in my chest. I was definitely telling the truth, but I didn't want to be responsible for someone going missing, and I also didn't want someone to convince them that I was lying. "Look, I don't want to get involved. Just ignore what I said." "Too late. I'll be in touch." I was pretty freaked out, and I was also pissed because the crackhead skank next to me ran her mouth and told him I was there. I just verified she wasn't lying, but now I'm on the hook. So fast forward a few months, and I'd cleaned up my life. I quit doing drugs. I was only smoking a bit of weed and occasionally eating mushrooms, and started exercising. I had been accepted into the Air Force and was getting ready to do something positive with my life, when one day I came back from a meeting with the recruiter and my roommate said, "Hey man, your dad's been looking for you. Showed up 3 times since this morning." "My dad? Huh? I haven't spoken to him in like 3 years. How does he know where I live?" "No clue, man. He was just really hell-bent on talking with you." "What did he look like?" I asked. "Old dude, beard, hand tattoos, denim jacket." "That's not my dad." I was freaked. I knew who he was describing. The fact that the biker showed up was bad news, and the fact that he'd showed up 3 times means he was determined to catch up with me. And worse still, he was pretending to be my father so he could lure me to the door. I never found out what he wanted, and I never found out if anything happened to the young biker. I moved out that night and lived in my car until my basic training date, and last time I was back in Vermont, the crackhead was still in the house, smoking crack and chumming it up with the bikers. I think I dodged a bullet there, and it still creeps me out to think about it. So I used to work mid-shifts for a couple of years. I would get off of work at around 2 a.m. and be at the parking lot in the building basement by around 2:30 or 3. On one particular night as I got off of work, I exited the elevator and there was a guy wearing the company maintenance uniform sweeping the floor. But he wasn't the usual guy that I see when I get off my shift. You see, I was friends with the guards, receptionists and maintenance people in my building, and I would always bring them coffee from our pantry and sometimes the occasional packed bread from our vending machine. But I wasn't sure who this new guy was, and for some reason I was creeped out by him. Maybe it was because I couldn't see his face, as his shoulder-length black hair was covering it. So instead of giving him the coffee I was holding, I decided to walk straight to my car. I could hear my heels clicking on the floor. but then I also heard a second set of footfall, so I walked faster. I then noticed that whoever was following me began to walk faster too, so I decided to start running. Now my car has keyless entry, thank goodness, so I just pushed the button and literally jumped in, pulling the door closed and clicking the remote button to lock the car immediately. It was the new maintenance guy. He was smiling and trying to open my car door and pressing his face against my window. He wasn't saying anything though, only smiling whilst trying to open my car door. Now my car is set to go on alarm if the door is locked using the remote and was started from inside, so I proceeded to start the engine and the alarm went off. The guy then stopped trying to open my door, stood up straight, gave me a salute and walked away. After what felt like hours, the building guard and the maintenance guy that was usually assigned to my parking floor approached my car, and they were surprised to find me inside, with coffee spilled all over me and sobbing. I told them what had happened, and neither one of them knew who the guy I was describing was. After that incident, there were more guards assigned in the parking areas, doing rounds hourly, and I thankfully never saw that guy again. This also made me more careful whenever I went out, into any parking area, and I now always have a can of pepper spray handy. I also added a whistle on my ID lanyard, and bag straps for added precaution. So I'm European, and when I was 16 I attended a Catholic high school in the States. It was all new to me, of course. There were so many things I had only seen in movies, things that amused me, some that weirded me out, and some that annoyed me. I loved it though, and I always had a great spirit of adaptation. So within the first month I was there, I'd already had a great group of friends. It felt precisely like being in a movie sometimes, having lunch with the cool kids at the most popular table, lockers, emergency shooting simulations, football games, and all the new and exciting things to me. Another new thing for me was having to change classes every hour. In the country where I'm from, you sit 5 hours at the same desk with the same people sitting in the same seats, while the professors alternate every hour. In fact, one of my favourite classes was English, because it was the one my friends and peers attended the most. I was sitting next to this guy, who for privacy reasons I'll call Mark. He was very nice and friendly, despite being a bit of an introvert. Everyone knew him. The school was small, and among peers we really hung out 100% despite the differences, and he was no exception, despite not being the most charismatic of the school. It amazed me that whenever I talked to him, he never looked me in the eye. He would always look around or at the ground, often moving his eyes quickly. This fascinated me, and of course didn't disturb me at all. I found it a way to combat shyness, so no red flags. A month goes by since my arrival, and things were going very well. One morning I sat down next to Mark. He was my desk mate, and we talked as usual. I asked him if he could let me copy the last part of the homework that I had not been able to do during study hall, and he accepted very kindly. We continued to chat and say goodbye. The next day went smoothly, and the next day I noticed that Mark didn't come to school. A few more days went by, and a rumour began to circulate in the hallways that poor Mark, on his way home, had found his mother dead. That's terrible, I thought. Such a good kid doesn't deserve such a big trauma. No one does. 2 more weeks passed, and the rumours of course continued to circulate, and we heard the most absurd theories. The mother had her head in the oven. She'd committed suicide. She was attacked, robbed, strangled, and in short a great series of things that do not give peace to the poor lady who left us. I was very annoyed by this attitude, where this was being treated like any other gossip. Mark went back to school one day, and he was very sad. The gossip ceased, although in a low voice you could still hear commentaries. but we, his friends in the senior year, squeezed into his grief without crossing the line. I'm here for you. I'm so sorry. My condolences. Come on, let's go out for lunch afterwards. And the usual things you say to a grieving friend. I've never been good at this stuff, so in English class, I put my arm around him and said a very simple, I heard, I'm sorry. And he for the first time looked me straight in the eye and thanked me. He was a different person. There was a darkness in his eyes that gave me goosebumps. He was deeply sad, but it wasn't just sadness. It was almost despair. He's grieving, I thought. If this were to happen to me, I don't think I could ever recover. So I understood and respectfully left him to grieve. The next day, Mark was absent again. And it was normal, I kept thinking. I wouldn't be able to make it to school one day, I get it. And meanwhile, completely unrelated, a man started hanging around the cafeteria during lunchtime. I asked around who he was, and they told me Miss Leffe's husband. She was the school counsellor, and the rumours around the school meanwhile continued to swirl, and I got really angry, because this time they were really exaggerated. You have to show respect and stop even thinking such things, I told my friends. Another week went by and the atmosphere at school had literally turned to ice. From the speakers, the principal's voice called all the seniors to the gym for a communication. And we went there where Mr. McDad, Miss Leffe's husband, was. This time, however, I heard his voice for the first time, and he told us what we already knew. Mark had killed his mother by choking her. Although the idea had already formed in my mind, I felt the blood freeze in my veins. I didn't get the creeps, simply because of the fact that an acquaintance of mine had the courage to kill his mother. I come from a fairly violent country. I have acquaintances in jail and others who, also free, have done some bad things, but never like this. Now Mr. Baghdad was the town detective and was literally conducting investigations at the school. He told us of what happened that one morning. Mark had asked his mother for the car keys to get to school, which she needed, and after she refused, he jumped on her and strangled her. Then he came to school and sat next to me, gave me English homework as if that was the main problem of the day, came home and called the police. The school also provided a psychologist, but no one went to him. In retrospect, I think a chat with him wouldn't have hurt though. I was literally in an episode of 13 Reasons Why, 5 years before it aired. In my school and my country, dealings and fights happen quite often, so I thought I had seen enough. But obviously I was wrong, and every now and then I still think about Mark's deeply empty eyes staring back at me. Back in the mid-90s, my family had lived on the island in BC, as my stepdad had gotten a job at the main Toronto University, and we were to move that summer. I was 13 at the time, and not prepared for what a large city had lined up. The trip was long, and I ended up grounded before we even got there, something about running away and a tantrum on the ferry early on. But in the building we lived, there was a yard and kids played baseball there. I was really excited. So in my first month there, this one tall kid threatened me with a large hunting knife, which led to charges, and the following 2 summers I had been approached by 2 paedophiles. The first incident, I was at an arcade, where I liked to play pinball a lot, when this older guy had chatted me up, saying how he needed help moving some stuff, and would pay me $50. I was like, hell yes, so we left and went around to the back alley, where I guess I used up one of my 9 lives, because I got into his car, and when he got in, he turned to me and said, "Actually, there are no boxes. I just wanted to suck you off a little." I was stunned. I jumped out and called him a freak, then ran off. The next time it happened was again at the arcade, which I guess is the stomping ground for pedos. But this one guy started chatting me up and was definitely playing the long game. Apparently he had an independent record label for indie bands, and after a while he asked me if I'd put up posters for him, which he would pay me for. So I agreed and did just that. I'd go around putting them up, marking the address, and thought I was doing a good job. However, after a while, this person, we'll call him Dave, started to become a little friendlier and would ask when I was going to visit him at his place to hang out. I was like, nah, and avoided the subject completely. However, he eventually found out that I played chess and started to bring it up in conversation. One day we went to the library to play chess, as I figured it was a public enough place. And on the last game he was making a bet that if he won, I'd have to visit him at his place. Luckily I managed to draw the game, and after that last encounter, I distanced myself and stopped seeing him in general. He was for sure a predator, and I dodged a bullet with that one. Then fast forward a few years when I was 16 and I'd received an email from him. It said how he was aware of a certain amount of internet activities and had to talk to him about it, etc. if I wanted to be safe. I wasn't having any of it and responded immediately, telling him I knew he was a paedophile, and if he ever tried to talk to me or blackmail me again, I was going to go to the police. I was scared and thankfully he never contacted me again, but looking back at it now that I'm an adult, I realised maybe I should have told the cops anyway, in hopes that no one else would have to deal with that creep. My mum's old employee showed up at our house unannounced, so it may be because I have pretty bad anxiety that this creeped me out so much, but like the title says, that's what happened. So my mum and I had gotten back from work. We ate, showered, and Mum got into bed ready to go to sleep. It was only 7 p.m, but she was working again at 2. I was in the kitchen about to start making my lunch for work tomorrow, when my ring alarm alerted me that someone was at the front door. Now we have an Alexa with a screen, so I'm able to see out through the camera without having to go to any windows. My mum had also gotten a notification and went to look at her phone and saw that it was a guy that we didn't know. Now we can also speak through the camera, so she asked him who he was and what he wanted. But all he replied with was her first and last name. She asked again what he wanted, and he said something pertaining to her job. For example, if she worked as a teacher, he'd say the school name and the class she taught. She asked one last time who he was and what he wanted, but he just said her name again and the job thing. She ended up just telling him to go away as she was in bed and about to go to sleep. So he did. The creepy thing is, though, that my mum didn't recognize him, and he wouldn't identify himself. We also don't know how he got this address. And it's also a little bit creepier for me, because my mum's boss messaged me on Facebook a couple of times, saying how much I look like my mum and how pretty I am, and that he wants to talk to me so much because I look like my mum. It really sucks though, because we both leave for work when it's dark outside, and that guy seemed really unhinged. It also sucks that it's just my mum and I, and we don't have a guy around or a dog to intimidate people we don't know at our house. We used to have a dog, and people would think twice before walking up to our porch because they could hear him barking. After calming down and sleeping on it, he may have just thought she was going to be like, "Oh wow, Fred, haven't seen him in a while, let him in." But she didn't recognize him, and there's the whole pandemic thing, and he didn't even have a mask on. I asked my mum about the old boss, and it turned out he had actually died a little while back. The message he had sent me was a little before he'd passed away, which makes me feel a bit bad, because maybe he just wanted someone to talk to. This was years ago when I was 23, and my husband and I had recently rented a house in a new town. At this time, about 2 years earlier, we had decided to leave our local church because it was becoming more of a cult than a holy congregation. I had a lot of knowledge about the Bible at this point, and I was kind of searching spirituality for something. One day while my husband was at work, I was at home with our sons, who were 2 and 3. It was pouring out when I got a knock at the door. It was a glass sliding door, so I could see through to who was standing there, and immediately I thought, ugh, more Jehovah's Witnesses with watchtower pamphlets. But it was a white woman in a dress suit, and a tall, at least 6 foot Asian man, also wearing a suit and was holding a briefcase. Now we lived really closely to all the other houses in the neighborhood, and we had people that lived above us too. So with that in mind, I felt safe enough to go to the door and talk to them. I was about to tell them no thanks, when they said that they were from the World Mission Society Church of God, and they wanted to tell me all about Mother God. This piqued my interest. If it hadn't have been raining, I would have talked to them through the screen door, but I felt bad and let them in. I know, so stupid, and I definitely regretted it. We went into the living room where my boys were playing, and the lady had the creepiest smile and was staring at my kids. She said, "I love kids. I really want kids of my own, but I wasn't blessed with being able to." Then she started telling me about their church and how Jesus, or Mary, I can't remember, was reborn in South Korea. She then stopped abruptly and told me that the guy could take my children into their room and play with them there, so we don't get distracted. Then she said something to him in, I'm guessing, Korean, and this is when I knew I was an idiot and shouldn't have let them in. I said, "Absolutely not. My kids are fine right here." She then tried to convince me that we needed quiet to pray to the mother, but I just said, "I don't give a crap. I don't know you people." The guy then opened his briefcase, where he had little shot glasses and a glass pitcher of some purple liquid. They told me that my children and I had to make communion right now to save our souls, but I said, "No way, I think it's time for you guys to leave." Her whole face changed and she got really angry. She started yelling that I and the children will burn in hell if we don't drink this now. I stood up and said, "Get out of my house now." Then her face changed back to the creepy smile and she said, "Okay, we're going to take the children with us to our church. There's tons of other kids there. I'll send you the address once we get there." I went into panic mode, and I was already standing in front of my kids at this point. I started screaming, "You're not touching my kids. Get out now." As I was walking towards them, she said, "We need to save the children." At this point, the guy actually seemed pretty clueless, like he was just waiting for her to tell him what to do. I was screaming "get out" over and over again, and was threatening to punch her. I knew I couldn't have taken the guy on alone, so I was trying to think of how to get them out. Then a light bulb went off in my head. I grabbed my phone out of my pocket and yelled, "I'm calling the cops." So they turned around and ran out the back door, and I watched them run down the street until I couldn't see them anymore. I told my husband when he got home from work, and he was pissed that I'd let them in the first place, understandably. The next night I was at work and my husband was home with the kids. Now our house had a ton of windows, and our bedrooms didn't have curtains on them yet. He put the kids to bed and started watching TV in the living room, when he sees faces looking in through the windows. Going over, he asked, "Who the hell are you?" They asked if I was there, as I'd apparently told them to come back tonight as they needed to talk to me. "I know who you are. Now get off my property," my husband replied. They then went around to the next window and looked in, just as my husband ran outside to look for them. They took off running, and my husband yelled after them that he was calling the cops. I don't remember if we made a police report or even called them, as it was a long time ago, but thankfully I never saw them again. I was scared for a long time after that, and I'm pretty sure it was a child sex trafficking ring, as well as a weird cult. Now I don't answer the door unless it's someone I know. So I was vacationing in the south of France with my cousins. There were 3 of us, and we were staying in my grandparents' holiday home. The property is a bit of a castle, and had 12.5 hectares surrounding it that are empty, and there isn't a single house less than 1 kilometre around. It was summer 2019, and Caesar, one of my 2 cousins, had just turned 19. He asked me and my other cousin Arthur if we wanted to spend 2 weeks in our grandparents' house so we could finally do something without the rest of the family and have the house to ourselves. You see, we usually go there every summer, but it's always with the family. So Arthur and I, being only 17 years old at the time, couldn't do everything we wanted. So we left for our crazy vacation in early July, and we were really looking forward to it. The first week went really well. We spent most days getting up at 1 p.m. and having breakfast. Then at 3 p.m. we'd go to the pool and sunbathe the rest of the day. Come evening, we'd have parties with music at full volume and plenty of alcohol. During the second week, we continued our usual routine. Except one particular night around 1 to 2 a.m. after stopping the music, we could hear a small noise in the gravel path of the property. We didn't panic because it was quite common for animals like foxes or cats to be roaming around at night. So it was nothing alarming, and we thought nothing more of it. Everything was still going well. That is until the next day, when again we had turned off the music and had also turned off the lights. It was 1 a.m. and we were talking about everything and nothing. You know, those late-night futile discussions. When we suddenly heard footsteps in the gravel path again, but this time they sounded like a person walking, like regular footsteps. But there was no one there. I alerted Arthur and Caesar and told them that I had just clearly heard footsteps walking in the gravel. They hardly moved, so I decided to go to the window to see if I could see anything or anyone. It was definitely footsteps and was very clear. We were sleeping with the windows open as it was very hot, so it couldn't have been any clearer. I figured I'd have no risk in going to the window, because the lights were off. So whoever it was out there wouldn't see me at all. The moon that night was really bright, and the light from it made a shadow of the house we were in. But also, unfortunately, I saw a shadow of a person too. I saw the shadow of a man, and he seemed to be looking for something. I kept from yelling and told my cousins that there was someone outside, and that we needed to be as quiet as possible. On going back to the window to take another look, the man was now looking at me and standing stock still. Now, as I'd said earlier, we are in a godforsaken place, so we had very little signal for contacting anyone. We were on the 3rd floor, and this guy was getting closer to our front door, which was luckily locked, but isn't much reassurance, as it's so old you could easily kick it in. So we're up on the 3rd floor, and that guy could come in at any moment and jump on us, because there's no other way out of here. We could then hear that he was trying to open the door, and after about 10 seconds, he stopped, then angrily screamed. I had an idea. That afternoon we had taken our grandfather's air rifle to shoot at targets hanging from trees, and we had left it in the bedroom. So Caesar grabbed it and shouted, "Get out of here, we're armed," and fired blanks to try to scare him away. We heard the guy hit his best sprint to get out as fast as possible, while Caesar continued shooting. Then we heard him get into a car and speed off into the night. We didn't sleep at all that night, obviously, but at least we never saw or heard anyone come back late at night again. We never told anyone about it either, because we were too afraid of being yelled at. And even today, when we talk about it, we ask ourselves the same question. What would have happened if we were asleep, and he had been able to get in? Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.